Hello, everyone, and welcome to another art clinic online this weekend. We have an incredible artist, Kristina King, who is a multidisciplinary artist working in handmade papers. And with these handmade papers, she does a lot of site responsive kind of installation pieces. Kristina is a very accomplished artist with multiple residencies, Vermont Studio Center, the Women's Studio Workshop, and has also received a lot of awards from DC Arts and Humanities and individual artist awards from Maryland State Art Council. You may have actually found some of her work at the Kennedy Center, Anne Marie Sculpture Garden Art Center, Maryland Art Place, Pyramid Atlantic, or Allegany Arts Center. Or you may actually know her as the secretary to the board of directors for the DC Art Studios, or as I know her, which is the exhibition and gallery coordinator at Glen Echo Park. So it's nice to see some Glen Echo Park people at the meeting today. So we're excited to present one of our own as our guest artist for this weekend. So without further ado, I'd like to say thank you for Kristina King for being here, and take it away, I guess.
Yeah, thank you, Jordan, and Mariana for having me. So yeah, let me share my screen.
Perfect.
Great. Okay. So, sorry, let me just minimize. Oh, my cursor disappeared. Let me, sorry. Okay, I'll just leave it like that. So I wanted to start off with just how to make handmade paper, so we all sort of have like a baseline of understanding. So there are a couple different ways you can make handmade paper. One would be using cloth rags or cotton-based paper, anywhere from fabric scraps. So I primarily do this paper making method. You can also make it from plants. I use abaca, flax, and there are a couple other other papers. Or you could use scrap paper, like some people, if they're doing it for the first time, might try with newspaper and blending it in, in a regular kitchen blender. So once you have picked your fiber, you'd want to then make pulp or actually break down the fiber. So Paper Slurry has this great infographic that's showing the Hollander beater. So that's kind of the primary paper making tool that I use to break down the pulp into what I can use to form sheets. There's also hand mallets that you can use for kozo and gampi and other plant fibers. And for if you're using newsprint, you could use just a basic kitchen blender, or you can buy sort of pre-packaged fibers that you can then rehydrate and break down at home. And then from there, you'll want like a mold and decal, which are basically, they're two screens. Two frames. One has a screen on it that lets all of the water drain out, and then all you're left is sort of a wet sheet of paper that you'll then want to couch or transfer onto a sheet. Like traditionally be using felts. Nowadays you'll use Pellon or interfacing that you can buy at the fabric store. And from there, once you've made, usually you'll make a stack of sheets at a time, and you'll want to remove the water by pressing it out, either using a hydraulic press, or you could use just a sponge and a brayer. And then from there, you can either air dry it, but that's depending on the type of paper that you're making. It could warp or crinkle as it goes, or you would want to like restrain dryer and so that it dries flat. So at the top right hand corner, I have just my basic paper making setup. I'll have my buckets of pulp that have been processed in the beater. I have a vat, which I use just an empty utility sink that's standing up. that has a stand, so that's easy to let the water drain underneath because it has a plug. There's the molten decal, and then you'll have a post, which is just the stack of, like I mentioned, you'll have the pellets interfacing, and you'll put sheets of paper in between. And so the molten decal is kind of what determines the size of the paper that you're making. So down there, you'll see a bunch of different sizes, and that's how you get the different size paper. And then in the bottom right is a picture of my Hollander beater that does a lot of the heavy lifting. So, this is one of my first pieces that kind of combined paper with installation art. I hadn't really learned paper making yet, so I was just starting with newsprint. I started with a basic form, just making a paper basket out of newsprint, and made it so it's like there was no end to it, just until the materials kind of fell apart. So I was working in the stairwell of where I went to school, which is Denison University. And then on the right-hand side is kind of what happened at the end. And from there, I started with the newsprint and wanted to learn how to make paper from it. And I had a professor that had paper making experience. So she's like, I'll order the correct paper fibers, and you can kind of go to town with it. So I just loved experimenting with the different types of fibers and see the quality of the paper I could get. So on the right hand side, I used Abaca, and it wasn't very high shrinkage. It wasn't processed for very long, so you get relatively flat sheets. And then you'll see on the left hand side that's more flax and kind of the overbeaten pulp, so you can get really sculptural elements, and these are all just air dried, so you can see the quality of the different types of paper you can make. So I then sort of took over the gallery space and make it into my studio. And we didn't have any papermaking classes, so I started teaching other students and members of the community how to make paper for about 2 weeks. And I was working on another installation at the same time. So I had, the other students help me to create like a larger construct and piece, including this window installation, as well as combining newsprint and just blank sheets of paper. And this was for North Park Place. This installation, site-specific installation, is called 1933. So there was kind of this falling down building, but it revealed a lot of newspaper that was originally used as insulation from 1933. So I was using the handmade paper that I was making in the other space to kind of highlight specific articles and have people just look at the floor instead of just the walls in the space. So as the installation moved on, the space kind of turned back to the way it was and just messed up papers all over the ground. So that was that piece.
Hey, Kristina, can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
What is it about paper rather than like painting or marble or sculpture of any sort? What is it about paper that was so enticing to you as a young artist?
So I think I do work in a traditionally multidisciplinary way, and my background at the time had been primarily drawing, charcoal drawings, pastel drawings, and with paper, I can make it more sculptural. Using paper as a medium, there were just kind of endless possibilities, and learning all these different recipes that I could make, different qualities of paper, were kind of exciting to me. I could make pulp paint, which I then learned is almost like painting out of paper. There's other applications that are more like screen printing. So I think I had taken drawing to a certain level, but paper, I feel like it was kind of limitless. I wasn't reaching the end. So.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah. So then I, after I graduated, I did internship at Judene, which is a papermaking nonprofit in New York City that teaches artists that don't have a background in papermaking how to incorporate it in their practice, and also worked at Pier Mid-Atlantic here in Maryland. And these are some of the pieces that I was making there. There were other artists working in the space, so sometimes there are a lot of fibers left over. So these were kind of the combination of that. I also, like I said, had the background in drawing, so I was combining charcoal powder and graphite in these pieces. So this is what they looked like. So that was kind of the wet process, and here's one of them. See and then they were installed in Artomatic, which hasn't happened for a few years, but they would take over empty commercial spaces, and each artist would get about like half a room in this typically like large office spaces. So this is my installation there.
These are absolutely fabulous. They really have a nice atmospheric quality to them, but also when you get into like the holes, they become sculptural.
Mm-hmm.
That's really cool.
And these, I don't know if you read the description, but there are lots of different fibers in here, cotton, abaca. So like you said, there's some elements are more sculptural due to the quality of the paper, the fibers that were in there. And they're all hand dried. So this is, a similar process. And I used like a hose at the end to kind of create this rippled effect as it was drying.
When you're making paper, sorry to interrupt again, but you've never had a paper artist, so this is all very new to me.
Sure.
When you make a lot of pieces like this, what is the percentage of them turning out versus you just kind of stick it under your bed? Like, if you were to have to exhibit 10 pieces, how many pieces do you have to make to whittle down to those 10 that you actually exhibit?
I'd say for the large scale ones, I probably make 4 or 5 at a time. I'm usually happy with like 2 or 3 of them. And then some I might repurpose and cut down and make into new paper. Because reuse the fiber. So yeah, these ones, they're actually they're poured. So I imagine really large molds. So that has a screen. Usually I use like bed sheets or something that I staple to either a frame that I made out of flooring or 2x4s, and then pour it in, and it will dry directly on the screen. So these aren't pressed.
And there's also a question in the chat about how do you hang these on the wall? How do you exhibit them?
So in my studio, I'll just hang them up with push pins because they're relatively light, or if they're a little thicker, I'll use binder clips. But then in an exhibition setting, I'm actually using magnets, rare earth magnets that can hold up to 20 pounds. So I'll put a carpet nail or something that has a wider, like flat head behind it, and then use the magnets. And then, so then in 2018, I had the opportunity to purchase a paper mill. So like I mentioned on the first slide, it included a Hollander beater, a press, a bunch of different molds and decals. And so that really expanded the range of work that I was able to produce in my studio and take on a little more ambitious projects. So I was also got into this time working with collagraphs and different relief prints instead of just pouring my paper into the molds. So on the left, I just ink up a lot of scraps. I was working at a frame shop in gallery at the time, so a lot of discarded materials that were too small to make frames out of, I would then repurpose and ink up. And then on the right, you can see I'm using casting cotton and just taking little globs at a time putting it on the print, the inked up plate, and then removing a lot of the excess water with the sponge. And I would just kind of repeat this process. You can see at the bottom right picture. So you kind of do it until the plate's completely covered. So that's a good method if you're doing this at home to try. You could just buy the fibers and then process it in a blender. And so that was what this piece ended up looking like. So you're kind of working backwards. So the last layer is the back, and what you see is kind of the first layer. And then I made a lot more using this paper cast. And sometimes I would put different sheets on the beginning layers and then work backwards and have it all sealed up with the casting cotton. Those are more collagraph relief prints. And then, like I said, because I had the paper mill, I was able to make larger installations. This is kind of in process shot for an installation that I did at the Takoma Park Community Center, which is it was a three-story hanging installation in their atrium space. This is I was embedding my paper with deer netting to kind of give it that stability, because it was a hanging installation. So here's just like one section of it. I was preparing to take it over to the space.
When you make make your more sculptural paper things, does it always need to support like deer netting, or do you use often just the paper itself?
You can use, the paper itself. I was just a little nervous because this was my first time doing an installation like suspended from 2 or 3 stories up, that I did want to have that structural element embedded in the paper. But if I were just hanging on a wall, you'll see it's just the actual paper itself. It's usually pretty sturdy, and there are fibers that you can use too that it won't tear, like the high shrinkage abaca and the flax are probably my go-tos for that kind of work. This was cotton, which isn't a very strong fiber. So I have like a short bit, please. Oh, oops. From the Takoma Park City TV, so you can see the.
Oh, cool.
And I also had large scale pieces on the wall.
Can you talk a little bit about, like, with these pieces you have in the atrium here, the Takoma Park place, like what kind of emotional response are you hoping to evoke from viewers?
Well, so it's kind of, you can't really see it in the clips here, but you enter in on the second floor and it's very much, there are classes going on, classrooms, other libraries. So there's a constant stream of people, and every time like the door opens, there's kind of like this rush of air into the space. So they would, as like the door would open, you move. So I wanted people to kind of get a sense of this moving space, and because sometimes people are just streaming right by it. So yeah, those are the things I was thinking about. But so from there, it was kind of immediately, I did a residency at Women's Studio Workshop, and this I had access to a lot of paper making equipment, larger press, a different type of beater, and I was working with dyed paper, pigmented paper, and also watermarks. So here are some of the watermarks I made. So I'm actually cutting up what they call magnetic sheeting, usually based off of drawings, and I apply it directly to the mold. And wherever you see those lines, it's going to be thinner in that area. So on the right-hand side, you'll see that's what the watermark will look like when light passes through it. So I was playing with the different imagery from homes that I lived in the area. And so this was a piece I made while I was there using watermarked high shrinkage abaca that I had dyed.
Christine, there's a question actually about kind of the archivalness of working in this fashion with, the different types of pigments, if they fade or not, or even just the paper themselves, if they, fall apart or deteriorate. I'm thinking back to the same kind of atrium with the wind and how that affects I guess it was titled Decay, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
There were 3 other shows happening at the same time, and so the piece itself was called Foreboding, but yeah, the general exhibition was called The Beauty of Decay. There are ways you could check like pH and other things. I do use aardvark pigments that are supplied by a papermaker supplier. I'll list a bunch of resources at the end. Carriage House for one. So they are light fast. I do think about that. Most of the time I'm not necessarily, so I'm only usually working with those materials, maybe charcoal. I'm not really adding too much to it. Yeah, so I have this piece here was also one that I first created at Women's Studio Workshop, and then I reinstalled it at Anne Marie Sculpture Garden. So it's called Windswept. So it did take a slightly different reiteration when I was in the space. It was in their almost 2nd floor loft gallery and closest to the window. And then here's a close-up. So these are like I was mentioning, it's the high shrinkage abaca and flax that don't require necessarily a structure inside. They kind of hold their shape depending on how you install it. So I just used T-hinges that were relatively invisible. And then in January 2020, I went to Allegany factory in Japan to learn about the kozo harvest. Like I mentioned, I primarily use cotton and fabric as my fiber source. So be able to learn about what it takes to harvest paper-making plants is amazing. So this is a picture of their paper mill. And then that was kind of at the bottom of the hill, and at the top of the hill, they had these kozo plants, and see that they were cut down. And so we were chopping them into sections, kind of starting at the top row into these sections of pieces, and then they were steamed. It's like the bottom row, and then we were removing the outer layer of bark that you don't use for paper making on just, it was like a sawhorse with a rebar between, and then we were cutting it down too, and then it would dry. And then here's there's a video of me I was peeling a different fiber called Mitsumata. It's like the chrysanthemum bush that was harvested, I think, every few years. It's not every year. And this, you would actually just, it was really hard work to just like peel the bark off. This is after it was steamed.
Kind of looks like you're pulling taffy.
Yeah. And then almost immediately I got back, and I think I was back for like a week, and then I went off to Vermont Studio Center, and it's just an amazing place. There are probably like 50 or so artists and writers there at once. And so I made these pieces. While I was there, I brought abaca fiber and cotton fiber to work with. And I was making relief prints using cast and just like leftover scraps from previous residents that they had, like in the wood room. So there's some of these are the kind of the cutoffs that I was using and inking up. A similar process to the collagraphs that I showed earlier.
How do you, on the previous slide, how do you attach the paper to other paper, and how do you attach it to the wall?
Oh, that's a good question. So I started off with 8.5 by 11 sheets. So I made a big stack of them. And then while they're still wet, I can attach them to each other. And then I use a glue called methyl cellulose. You can get it at like an art supply store, to just make sure that they would stick together as they dried. And I intentionally didn't cover all of the pieces in a single sheet. So they were sisters 1 and 2. I made them from that same pile that you see in this slide that I then just re-inked. And here's a close-up of one of them. So you can kind of see where there was some overlap from the individual sheets. And like I said, they're only 8.5 by 11. And then here's, oh. So that's how I would peel them off. You can kind of get a sense for the quality of the paper. It's very thin, almost translucent, because this was the high shrinkage abaca. And then I made some other pieces in a similar method. This one was using cotton fibers instead, so it's a lot thicker. And then I also made some site-specific installations while I was there. This one I was using abaca, the same 8.5 by 11 sheets, and I decided to cover the bridge that spanned throughout the campus from like the living area to the studios, and people used it to walk. And it was, keep in mind, this is February and it's like 11 degrees outside. So I kind of wanted to see how far I could go with the pieces that I had made. And then here's
Wild.
it drying overnight. There's still, you can see there's some snow on top. And I wasn't using glue. This was just, I had like a little bit of overlap and pressed them together. You can see by the morning, some of the pieces had already dried and peeled off. Others were still stuck on because the snow was melting on top of it. So, and then I peeled all the remaining pieces and hung them in my studio there.
Please make sure everything's muted, guys. I'm just muting people. Thanks. Yeah. Sorry. We had a quick question about James asked, are you using armature or scaffolding or just your hands to mold? Do you use any other tools in that kind of fashion of molding thing?
I was using my hands. You can also, if you're casting with paper, I like using just one of those cheap foam brushes to help press the paper to whatever form. Because this again is like the abaca, I knew that it wasn't going to take up a perfect cast of the bridge. And that's, yeah, that's kind of my intention, but there are other fibers you could use, like casting cotton, if you were going to do something small, to take an exact cast of whatever
also there's
object.
a question about, like, besides like kind of the traditional paper fibers and things, do you use like silks, or somebody asked about dryer lint?
No, I haven't experimented with those. Yeah, I do use sometimes like not fully processed fibers, specifically fabric, like longer strands of fabric. And you can, anything that's like not really traditional, like synthetic, you could use formation aid or a glue in the paper making process to help it bind, because if it's not natural, then it's not gonna bind to itself. It'll just kind of fall apart without like another additive. Yeah, so then when I got back, this is, March 2020, so I kind of shifted gears, and I had stacks of 100% cotton fabric that I had in my in my studio for paper making purposes. But then I also have a sewing machine, so I was making masks. Pretty early on, I made thousands of masks and donated them, and helped other people in our community. And all the excess from that process I then turned into sheets of paper. So all the color you see here is actually from the fibers, the paper making, the fabric scraps. So you can see on the right hand side. So at the top, that's kind of like the scraps left over from fabric mask making. And then I would cut it down. You need to have it at least like 1 inch by 1 inch squares or smaller. And then I would process it in my Hollander beater. And these were poured sheets that I had. Studio. And then, yeah, here's some more recent ones. So I'm still using fabric. And then there's also from other projects, there's some high shrinkage abaca in here too. And then here's like a close-up as they were drawing. And then here are some paper making resources. So if you're interested in learning more about paper or wanted to order some, there's Twin Rocker and Carriage House Paper. Those are the two paper maker suppliers. One's based out of New York. The other one's based out of Indiana or Illinois, I forget. But you can actually order fibers directly from them, so you don't necessarily need a Hollander beater. They'll have processed fibers there that you can use at home. I'd also recommend Mae Babcock's paper slurry blog. That's kind of how I got started learning more about paper making. And she also has a great resource, which is a map of all the paper making places in the world, and other private studios, and in like community spaces, also schools that teach paper making. Locally, there's Pyramid Atlantic Art Center. That's a paper making, printmaking book arts center in Maryland. There's Judenet in New York. Other books, probably Paper Maker's Companion. Would definitely be my go-to. There are a lot of recipes in there and how to like set up your own paper making studio. And then, yeah, then here's also information. If you have any more questions?
Awesome, thank you so much. We can probably go back to a grid format screen. Sorry, I'm talking out loud. And we can open up for questions. So if you have a question, go ahead and either unmute yourself, and Kristina can hopefully answer your question. These are awesome, by the way.
Oh, thanks.
Go ahead, Barbara.
Well, I thought it was an amazing presentation, and the variety of things that you've done is of extraordinary. Your passion is really wonderful. I love best the very lightweight, free-floating installations that responded to the air currents. It's just a comment. It's not really a question, but thank you very much.
Oh, yeah, I hope to do more of those. That was a real challenge for me.
I love that.
It was my first one, and kind of, you know, I had to construct it in a much smaller space and then reimagine it in the larger space. So yeah, I hope to do more of them.
Thank you.
So
Mary Beth asked, like, can you talk a little bit about like the duration, the process, like how long does it take to make some of these pieces? How long does it take to dry for the paper when you lay them down on top of like an armature of like the wood, for instance?
Sure. Yeah, so we can show, yeah, like for instance, with these, so the fiber itself, you kind of have to process it. So again, thinking about which fiber you're going to end up using. For like cotton fiber, it's only going to be in there maybe an hour in the machine. I try to book like probably a whole day if I'm making paper. I don't usually just make one. I make like lots of pieces at the same time. So I'll process my fiber first, and then it would probably take a few hours to do multiple pieces. I mean, each piece, you know, it only takes a few minutes just to pour it. I'd put like a plastic on it and then pull the plastic away, kind of like the table cloth trick, you know, when you're like removing a tablecloth with the place setting. And then I would say for the first few hours, I can't tilt it up. I have it kind of angled like this, because otherwise when it's too saturated, the fibers will just kind of with gravity just like slowly pull down to the bottom of the mold. But then as more water drains, I can prop it up. So at least 24 hours to have it be like able, so I can like prop it up. And then depending on the humidity is a huge factor. I don't leave pieces outside just because what if it starts raining again or something happens? So I usually have to put them back in my studio. And it usually takes a few days, like I'll have a dehumidifier going or something. But like the process of actually pouring is relatively quick.
And when you, for these ones in particular, like how much control do you have over like the placement of the black, kind of the charcoal powder? How much of it is like happy accident versus, you know, you, the artist, placing dark versus mid-grade kind of tones?
I like this method because I do have more control, because I should include inside, but I have, yeah, when I have the plastic in there, I can kind of place things and it'll stay relatively well. And then I can also, I also manipulate the form once I've removed the plastic, and it's kind of just like wet there, and there are things that you can add to slow down the draining. So then I'll like manipulate it more. So that way, yeah. And also if I just make sheets of paper as sort of a base sheet, and then I have more control to like add pieces on top of it. So
that's cool. In the chat I have from Ursula, she asks, what happens to the dirty water with residue particles of fiber? Does it get strained, or I guess this is both indoor and outdoor?
So yeah, indoor, I have a lot of control over that. I'll have plastic down, and then I actually end up reusing my fiber a lot. Like I have different strainers. I mean the water, excuse me. I use the water multiple times before I have to dispose of it. Like I'll rerun things. So yeah, I try to collect it as much as I can.
Any other questions? You guys can unmute yourself and ask them. It's not just me.
I have one. Kristina, first of all, your work is stunning. A question for you. Since you stumbled on, after making masks, introducing color into your work, what's your process now? Are you choosing color, not choosing? How has that impacted you? You know, you just stumbled more into it, but what's your feeling and direction with that?
Yeah, no, I have been. I've also, yeah, so I have been, like you mentioned, been using more color in my work. I've been sorting the fabric too, so that I kind of create a specific outcome with the colors that I end up. I don't necessarily know exactly what the color is going to be at the end of beading it, but I have a better control of it. I've also used those fabric scraps to create pulp paint, which for me lasts a little longer, and then I apply it as sort of at the end too. So I'm continuing to work with color and experiment with it, which is exciting.
Was it a stretch moving away from, because I mean, for such a long time it was kind of monochromatic, the work, and then did it feel uncomfortable at all, or was it kind of a natural kind of transition towards working in color?
I guess I always feel like it's almost like rusty, because with my drawings, I was using a lot of oil pastel, chalk pastel. So I had been working in color for a long time. And then I just preferred charcoal, and I didn't feel like the need to add anything extra to these pieces when they're black and white. But then I still feel like I'm not really adding anything to the pieces that are in color. Like that's the natural fiber that I'm using. I'm not like adding extra pigment to it. So I feel like there's still, a common thread there.
Mm. Anybody else? Cool. So what's next?
Well, as you know, I'm moving, so it's very hectic, but also exciting too. I'm definitely, I'd say like dependent on the spaces that I'm working in. So it's exciting, to be in a new space and what will come of it. So.
Yeah, that's curious. I think about that. Like, how does your environment affect the creativity flow? Like, I think for some people, like I'm going to use myself as an example. A new location is kind of a hard adjustment for production of artwork, but for you, it seems to kind of invigorate you and inspire you. Can you talk a little bit about like how you feel, or how you transition moving studios, or going to Japan, going to your Mid-Atlantic and working, however it may be, but just that process of interacting with your environment and how creativity works that way?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm definitely dependent on my environment and communities in general. I think I really thrive being in a community. It's great, like working at Glen Echo and being in a community of artists. I didn't share any sides here, but I think an important thing to know is that I grew up living on the campus of a school. So that is definitely familiar to me, as being in sort of a large community of people. So I do get excited working with others in a similar space.
That's cool. So where do you pull inspiration from? Like, for painters, at least, it's, clearly you just go to an art museum, there's tons of paintings available to us. But for paper artists, is there, I guess oh shoot, I'm drawing a blank. The Renwick, I imagine, has a lot of kind of more paper-based art on display, but where do you go to be inspired about making work?
So a lot of my inspiration probably from the materials itself and the endless possibilities of them. Just trying, almost a lot of it is like cooking, like trying new recipes and like, oh, I can use this material. There are places I can look and see, like Dudene has a great catalog of artists experimenting with paper making. So yeah, these are some places.
Very cool. Very cool. Anybody else before we let our incredible Kristina King go for the weekend and go do more moving, which she probably doesn't want to be doing.
I'll unmute myself. Are you moving toward more three-dimensional sculptural pieces, or do you always have a mix of flat versus sculptural ideas?
I think I have a mix of flat and sculptural ideas. It really depends on the project. I would like to do, yeah, more installation in combining high shrinkage, apica, and flax. It just takes a lot longer to process. I should mention this, it takes maybe 10 to 12 hours in the beater to make that kind of high shrinkage flax. So, but it is, yeah, something I definitely want to do more of. But I'm also have been, about a year ago, I started making ceramics. So I'm incorporating that too, and kind of learning a new media is exciting.
Do those cross-pollinate, like the ceramics and the paper?
I can make, if I want to go into like making casts of paper, I could then, yeah, work with clay to make like a mold out of it. But yeah, no, I'm making mostly like utilitarian, just like cups and bowls and that sort of thing. But it's just exciting learning a new media. So
You had one other installation on a wall. I couldn't see that the individual pieces were connected. Did you just have a map, a photograph of how you'd laid it out in the studio and then transfer it to the wall? Or did you have some transparent way of assembling the whole thing before you hung it?
So I think you're referring to is it the windswept one? This one?
These, yeah.
Yeah, so these are actually, yeah, they're not attached. You're correct. There's some pieces that I made them, they were overlapped, but I did have a picture initially, but then I did modify it as I installed it the second time. But what's nice about this one, it was all relatively compact. I could fit it in like a 12 by 12 box. So that was exciting because mostly my pieces are very large. So
Well,
I want to make more of
what
it.
you're doing is very inspiring. It's very, very interesting. And I like the move into away from totally black and white and into some color. It's very nice. And I'll be interested to see what you do using clay molds to make, other sculptural ideas. Really quite, oh, and I know what else. What is abaca?
It's a type of fiber. It's also called Manila hemp. It's from the Philippines. But I can mention some of the papermaker suppliers like Carriage House. You can buy it in these condensed, like they're dried condensed pieces of fiber that you can cut up, and you can even just process it in a blender, or they'll do it for you. So.
Is the paper making industry large? I mean, is it expanding or contracting? How would you define it?
It's relatively small. Like there was a resurgence like in the 70s with Dard Hunter. So there are like very few places. I think I had started paper making like 10 years ago. And since then, I think there have been a lot of artists working in handmade paper. So I think it has expanded a little, but there's still, it's very equipment heavy. So there are not that many places that focus on it.
Any final questions? Well, I want to thank you again, Kristina. It was such an incredible talk and very inspiring for, I guess, getting out of your comfort zone and trying something new. So we're very pleased about just all the work was just absolutely fantastic. So we wish you the best of luck moving forward and with the move.
Thank you for having me.
It's absolutely great.